Hello and welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Heart of the Cast, episode 17 or something. It's been getting along. 17 weeks we've done. That's actually kind of crazy
Hmm.
how much this done. We just hit 10,000 subs on YouTube, which is really cool.
Oh, did we?
Yeah, so
All right, you
thanks
told me. I
everyone.
remember. Nice.
It's been a great journey, and I think the feedback has been mostly positive. And obviously we're always taking feedback for topic ideas, etc., etc. Um, yeah, thanks for enjoying. It's been a real pleasure, and hopefully we'll get more guests and topics. But today we're going to be doing side decking.
Hmm.
We got a little bit of an itinerary here today, and we're gonna sort of tackle this in kind of two different sections. First of all, we're gonna look at side decking as a general teaching mechanism, because one of the things that Yu-Gi-Oh players kind of struggle with is side decking. It's probably the most underutilized tool.
It's
And like
also
Lise
one of the
talked about.
most popular, I guess, requests I'm getting for like a explanation video or whatever. So I'm gonna try to add some, or we're gonna try to add some aspects of like tips and tricks into the thing today. Probably it's very hard to summarize the entire thing of like how to side deck in like one short form sentence or whatever, but we're gonna try to add some tips into the mix on how to approach the entire thing. Well, yeah.
We're gonna do our best. And then second part is we're gonna be talking a little bit about side decking kind of conceptually, looking at like general sort of thought experiments here. Should the side deck even exist? What do we think about the concept of best of three? Other card games use best of one. Hell, there even is best of two, for example. So we're gonna be going through all of these different discussion points
Yep.
and debates of sorts throughout today. As always, make sure you do subscribe to the YouTube channel. So you can hit that notification bell to be alerted when the upload is. It's normally Saturday 3 p.m. is when the uploads are, and that's likewise on Spotify and Apple. Let's begin with our 10 minutes or so of yapping. We got a
Yapping.
little bit of
I
drama.
prepared a slide for the yapping.
Oh, did you? Okay, all right,
Yeah.
let's see it. Okay, you can take it away. I think the biggest topics that we haven't talked about on the podcast yet specifically is Rarity
Mhm.
Collection, which feels like forever ago, but also there's some new rule changes on
Yeah.
accessories. You
Yeah,
wanna take the
I
lead?
guess it's fitting to talk about Rarity Collection since today is also the day of its official release, right? Like the topic's a
Mhm.
little bit old because the reveals were like a week or two ago. You did one on your channel, right? You opened the box on your channel.
Yep, 2 boxes
Um
Rarity Collection. Soul
yeah,
and
so
Luna's looking pretty nice.
I guess you have more experience with it than me because I haven't opened a single pack yet even. So how do you think it felt like compared to the first one? Or like in general, did it feel like something you enjoyed opening or
So there's like a lot to unpack here because I think the biggest elephant in the room is like there's been quite a loud negative response to it.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's hard to gauge if that's a really loud minority or if it's actually the true sentiment of the community. One thing I will say is that I feel or I look very not as excited as Rarity Collection 1.
Mhm.
And the example I gave is that let's say that Rarity Collection 1 is like, an 8 out of 10 set, just using an arbitrary rating. Rarity Collection 2 could be 9 out of 10. It could literally be better than Rarity Collection 1. But Rarity Collection 1 is going to feel better to open because it was a huge revolutionary new product. It was a completely new style, new type of product that we'd never seen before. So I think by that logic, psychologically, it's just going to feel better regardless.
Mhm.
And I think that's where a lot of the I don't want to say disappointment might be the right word, but I guess some of the criticisms have been from the community is that it came off of the back of a really cool product.
Yeah.
But I think when you have such a banger product, anything that comes after it will just feel disappointing, even if it's good.
It's definitely very hard to like fill the footsteps of Rarity Collection 1 because it's like it was the first time we ever got something like this, and Rarity Collection 1 was amazing. Like you said 8 out of 10 and you said it was arbitrary, but I would argue like it was easily a 9 or a 10 out of 10 for how it felt like when it came out, right? And it is arguably very, very hard for Rarity Collection 2 to be as good as Rarity Collection 1, and I think that was the most common sentiment that I heard. It was like, man, it's worse than Rarity Collection 1, so I don't like it. I personally don't really understand that. I do think that something can be worse than Rarity Collection 1 and still be a good product. I don't think it's fair to hold every single product to the standard of pretty much the best Yu-Gi-Oh product that we've ever had. I think that's at least a fair sentiment or a fair thing to say. And I do also understand that there is reprints that are missing in Rarity Collection 2 that I will agree with. There is cards in the game right now that need a reprint and were not reprinted in Rarity Collection 2. But I'm looking at it from my perspective at least, and I'm seeing a lot of cards that I want. I'm seeing a lot of cards that were expensive and are now more accessible. It's not all of the cards that are expensive, but it's still a decent chunk, so I still like it.
For me personally, it does feel like a kind of annoying topic to talk about because I feel like we're in a very catch-22 situation where when you do influencing stuff for Konami, like, you know, you've been doing Challenger Cups, I do the reveals, it's like, it feels like you can't be positive because, well, obviously you would say that, right? Like, even if it's a genuinely good product, I feel like sometimes, you know, I'm not trying to be all like, woe is us, but it does sometimes feel like people may not take our thoughts on it as seriously, which is a little bit annoying because, you know, getting paid to run a tournament is very different to getting paid to enjoy a set, right? Like we don't need to do that, right? Like we're not paid to positively review something. And my genuine opinion on Rarity Collection 2 is that I think it's good. I think it's fine. And absolutely, every set can be better. There's always ways to improve, and there's always things that could be better. Low-key, Rarity Collection 2, I think, in some ways is better than Rarity Collection 1. The biggest thing that I think that Rarity Collection 1 has is that it had a really big sort of heavy-hitting reprint. Baron and Prosperity were massive reprints. Like people like Prosperity alone, I think, could carry like the quality and hype of Rarity Collection 1. But I think Rarity Collection 2 had overall a lot more kind of better cards. Because if you really look deep at like Rarity Collection, there's a lot of just random, like kind of like, who asked for this? Rarity Collection 2, basically every card is like pretty good, like a useful card. Some of them are old, but again, the idea I think behind Rarity Collection is that it's a rarity collection, right? It's sometimes people are like, where's the reprint? Where's the reprint? But I don't think it's designed to specifically be a reprint set, right? Like it is like there to, you know, people have been laughing at like MST, for example, but it's like, well, yeah, MST is an iconic card that now has all of these cool different rarities. That's like the logic.
Yeah. I mean, it's called Rarity Collection because it gives you a lot of iconic cards in a bunch of different rarities. And I think I personally think it's a good mix between like, you have some reprints of previously expensive cards. Like, I don't know, Guardian Chimera is a card that comes to mind. There's a bunch more. But it's also just like a lot of cards that maybe weren't expensive beforehand, but now are accessible in a lot of different rarities. Like, for example, if you want to play a nice looking Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, you no longer have to buy like the hundreds of bucks for like an ultimate rare. You can get the Rarity Collection, whichever one you prefer, and you're good to go, right? Same is true for Droll Lockbird, which previously, if you wanted a nice and shiny Droll Lockbird, it was basically ulti or collector's rare, which I'm pretty sure both were very expensive cards. And I think that's cool. That's an exciting part for me, right? The fact that reprints are missing is something I understand, but I still am very excited for a lot of the reprints that I'm getting, that I'm going to be playing, because I don't have nice Ghost Ogres so far. I'm going to get some, I don't know which ones I'm going to get yet, but I'm going to pick some up from Rarity Collection.
I think the fairest and sort of, I personally don't really see as very defensible is the price hike between Rarity Collection 1 and 2. I think this is a very legitimate position. So it's only fair to be fair to both sides of the argument here. I think quality-wise and card-wise, I think Rarity Collection 2 is fine mostly, but I think for a lot of people it is going to feel bad that it's literally double of the price, but you know, comparatively, I think you get the same amount of cards.
It's like I think you get like the first one was 5 cards per pack. This one is 9 cards per pack. So, and the price per pack got, I think it's about doubled. I'm not sure if it's an exact double. So technically per card, you're still, I think, paying the same. But the fact that you're forced to open basically the minimum you can buy a pack for is like a 9 card pack. You can't go for 5 anymore. So it's kind of like forcing people to buy more. I don't know exactly how like the distribution and all that works. Like if you have to open the same amount of packs to get the playsets of the cards and all that kind of stuff. I haven't looked into that precisely. I think it's just a matter of they realized how good Rarity Collection 1 was, and they wanted to jack the price up a little bit, because they thought they had like they probably felt like they undersold the Rarity Collection 1, is what I can imagine, right? They were like, with how well the set was received, we probably could have gotten a little bit more out of it, which is, I feel like from a company standpoint, that's a fair thing to think about Rarity Collection 1. Like if I made a product like Rarity Collection 1, I would be like, well, probably could have charged more for that with how much people liked it. But also it's natural that people don't like that development, right? Like if you're used to, or if that's what you know, like if you saw Rarity Collection 1 and that's the price you paid for it, like it always feels bad if something gets more expensive, right? Even though it's a normal thing from time to time that sometimes things get more expensive, but it never feels good, right?
Especially in such a big jump in such a short space of time. And again, even though technically you're, basically getting the same number of cards per price, the barrier to entry is just bigger now. So if you want to buy into the set, like it is just more expensive. So that is definitely a negative for a lot of people. And yeah, it is what it is. So hopefully we'll see more improvements on this in the future. I think Rarity Collection 3 next year or later whenever they decide it's time to break in case of emergency, we'll get another set of that, and hopefully they'll take that kind of feedback on.
I mean, that's the thing. At the end of the day, they're going to receive our feedback indirectly from how well this set performs, right? And I hope they plan to continue doing Rarity Collections, because I think we can agree that the concept is phenomenal, right? Like a recurring reprint set that gives us a mix of, some expensive cards that are now more accessible and some like staple cards that get multiple different versions. I think the concept is great. And I think if they reiterate over it in the next couple of years and find like a sweet spot for what people are happy to pay for it and what people expect out of it, then it's a good thing, right? But yeah, I guess that's all there's really to say.
Next minor topic is the new accessory change. So for those of you who have been uninitiated, there was a big announcement made from Konami, talking about the new rule change that's happening. They're saying specifically at the WCQ, but I don't really understand how that will just apply to every YCS going forward, I feel, right? Like, so that's probably what's going to happen. But basically what's happened now is you can no longer use like custom sleeves and mats at WCQ events. So that includes we don't have exact details yet, but the guidelines say specifically you need to have a solid plain color for your mat and sleeves, or officially Konami licensed sleeves or mats.
Yeah. I wonder if this is going to be something that at some point they move into the policy for all kind of levels of tournaments. I don't imagine it'll ever be something that would be enforced at something like a locals or something like that, but it's probably something that they throw in for the EU WCQ and other, like, is it even in effect for like nationals in Europe, or is it just Euros at this point?
All WCQ main event and world qualifying points playoff participants is what it says.
Okay. So that's Euros, or I don't know. Whatever.
Yeah, so I think the other one, I guess, that people forget about is Oceanics as well, right? Is what that comes under that umbrella.
It does count for Oceanics from what I've heard. Yeah. I think for the most part, I don't know. People are, I think on the one hand, I don't think it's a great change. On the other hand, I think people are reacting to it a little bit too hard. I don't think for me personally, it's not that big of a deal. I guess it depends a little bit on how heavily they enforce it. Like I've seen people mention concerns about, for example, people that have spent a lot of money on something like a Spellground, right? You're familiar with Spellgrounds, like these, and I've looked at those on stream and I was like, does that classify as plain? Because it's basically like a one-colored mat that just has some symbols on it. Like, is that plain or not? Like, are they really gonna call you out and tell you to change that if it's that kind of thing? I don't know.
Naturally, I think the attention to zones is probably the major thing, especially with I mean, I'm surprised. If anything, I'm surprised it took this long to really enforce. But zones, I think, is a major thing that a lot of cloth mats don't utilize. Some do, and some of the companies are actually going out of their way to make sure that cloth mats do have zones. But as a general rule of thumb, you will see like those classic spellgrounds and stuff like don't have zones, which is a huge portion, a huge part of the competitive gameplay. Now, okay, so positives and negatives. Positives. The one thing conceptually that I take away from this that I think is obviously really good. The article, if you read it, there is a line that specifically says, the reasons we are implementing these changes are the following. Regardless of what you think of these changes, that to me is just a major, major step forward. And I don't think Konami has ever done something and been so explicit with a sentence like that. The fact that they are making a change and saying we're doing this because, and then outlining those reasons, I think is a huge step forward in communication and player feedback and interactions with the community. So happy to see that. And the next positive I would add to this is, well, now we don't have to deal with those Coomer weirdo mats, right? Like that's probably the major issue. And I think the biggest positive takeaway from this is we don't have to get all kinds of really interesting, colorful mats of lovely Labyrinth and Masquerena, etc., etc. So that's a good thing.
I will say I don't remember the last time I've seen one of those, so I don't know how big that issue really was. But I do agree it's a good thing that is just categorically not allowed, right? That's a good thing. Even though people have been saying that was already covered in the policies beforehand, I think like it said something about like inappropriate stuff on your accessories or whatever.
Yeah, so that has always been not allowed, and the key point that they've brought up here is we see that judges frequently need to question if a game mat is appropriate for the attendees, which includes children in our Dragon Duel category. We wish to make sure that we focus judges' time away from having to monitor what accessories are being used, and more towards making sure your rules questions are answered in an appropriate time frame. So it seems like
basically the word inappropriate is very
very clearly
right?
what it's made that.
So it's like the judge is telling you your mat is inappropriate, and you're like, what do you mean? My dark magician girl has a bikini on, you know, like it's not even naked, and it's like they don't want to deal with that shit, you know, like get that mat out of here, right? So that's I guess the main thing they want to deal with, right? So it's like it's now clear cut, like it's not an official Konami mat, it has something else on it, so it's not allowed, right?
Onto the negatives, I think that this is a pretty negative change for me personally. I think that it's good that we have the attention to zones. I think it's important that we get rid of, you know, the really disturbing kind of behavior from people that I feel like the need to have these kind of mats is just, I don't understand it, but especially in a public setting, like Jesus Christ, man. But anyway, but the negatives are, it's like, having just like a nice, like neat spellground that has like a cool like art design and stuff on it, I think that they have really missed the mark on just how important aesthetics are to people. There are people who exclusively only play like things like, you know, League of Legends and different video games who spend a lot of money on the cosmetics because that is a huge part of their identity, their expression, and how they like to play these games. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Likewise, people love to be able to express themselves through what dice they use, what their deck box looks like, what design they have on their mat. People love mix and matching their favorite decks with a mat that works with that deck, you know, different themes and colors. Like I'm playing Marine Cess, I want a blue style mat, all that kind of stuff. Like I think it sounds, to some people, this sounds really dumb and really stupid. But it is a huge part of people's interest in the game, is like the ability to express themselves through these aesthetics and cosmetics. And I think that's, I'm not a fan of it.
Especially since like there's so much crossover between like people that are Yu-Gi-Oh players or Yu-Gi-Oh fans and being fans of other games or franchises, right? And it's like someone maybe has a really cool Pokemon mat or their favorite One Piece character on their playmat or whatever it is, right? And I feel like that kind of stuff gets caught in the crossfire, right? When they're doing that, and that is obviously something to be sad about. And I do understand the people that are upset about like having to or having spent a bunch of money on those kind of things, those accessories that they really like, and they're not able to use them. Heck, I picked up a one of those Pokemon Center playmats recently, the one that has like the Great Wave on it. that famous picture, and it's a bunch of Pokemon like riding the wave and all that kind of stuff. I think that was really cool. That's why I picked it up. And so I now I guess I can still use it. You know, it's just like I can't use it at big tournaments. So it's like that's the other thing, right? If you have those accessories and all that kind of stuff, right? As long as it's not enforced at every level of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh or whatever, you can still like go to locals with it, play with it on at regionals and all that kind of stuff. It's just that for the big nationals once a year or whatever, or maybe the couple YCSs you go to, you have to decide on a different mat. So I think from that perspective, like the rules are like that now, and we're gonna have to deal with it. And at the end of the day, I think people are gonna be fine. You know, it's just it's gonna take some time to get used to. Yeah.
Yeah, it's again, the most important thing is like for those of you who are like the majority of the player base, this won't really apply to, because I think the majority of the players don't attend YCSs. And you still be able to use all your cool stuff at locals and regionals, and I think that's obviously like an important takeaway. But I think being able to have like that fresh pack of custom sleeves, the fresh pack of oversleeves, the mat that you've got ready themed for your deck, that's a really exciting part of a YCS prep, in my opinion. You know, I think a lot of people really get a thrill from that, and I think it's a shame that that's kind of being taken away now. So. And again, to reiterate, the main reasons are, you know, making sure that things are appropriate. But another reason they mentioned is judges, because people can get very sharky with certain custom playmats and sleeves. And I think in order to just, rather than dealing with individual cases, you just make a blanket rule, and that's the easiest, fastest way to do it.
Yeah, I understand it. At the same time, I also, another thing is like I feel like especially the TCG department, which is enforcing this rule now, is kind of lacking in the providing cool accessories, because it says plain or Yu-Gi-Oh licensed, right? So if they gave us a bunch of options of like official stuff to choose from, I'm sure a lot of people would find something cool, right? But as a reality, like for the most part, you have to go to the OCG side of things to pick up like cool sleeves a lot of the times, right? Like there's like, what do we have? We have like the WCQ sleeves once a year, and then maybe in recent years we've gotten like artwork sleeves in some products. Like what was that? We got sleeves somewhere. I don't remember exactly where, but it's like it's not very common.
I think like Magikaribo, Masquerena, Dark Magician Girl, like that kind of stuff. I think like had
Mavens, the Mavens boxes came with it, which at this point that's 2 years ago. Mavens is like the end of 22. And so I think people would be less mad. People would still be mad, but it'd be easier to do that if there was more cool accessories from Yu-Gi-Oh directly, right? Like the OCG sleeves are legal because they're still Yu-Gi-Oh licensed, from what I'm understanding, right? But you have to go through, you know, some effort to get those, right? It's not as simple as getting them from a TCG product or something like that, right? And so that, I think that'd be a good way to a good compromise is if they made more cool stuff themselves.
I mean, just as a side note, I think like it's such an untapped thing in the TCG region to just have like just a straight up official Yu-Gi-Oh like website and store.
Yeah.
They do exist, but like imagine you could just go and get all kinds of different hoodies and t-shirts and then a bunch of different like official sleeves and mats.
I mean, I can tell how much people love this OCG stuff, right? Like the OCG consistently releases cool sleeves, they have cool playmats at their YCSs and all this kind of stuff. They have deck boxes, and people love that stuff, right? People love to buy those from the OCG and use those because they're so cool, and it's because something we don't have. I don't know what the reason is why they're not doing that here, but like for some reason they're only giving out like nice quality sleeves like once a year or something at tournaments, instead of just like throwing it up on a website where you can buy a pack of whichever card artwork sleeves you want for like a bunch of that would go super hard, I think.
And someone mentioned a good point in chat, and I think like the biggest thing is like this is a very small minor issue. It's not really that big of a deal if you think about it, but I think just in the whole sort of like past of the whole past year of Yu-Gi-Oh has felt like a real massive strain on competitive Yu-Gi-Oh players in Europe specifically. Not having YCSs, the kind of the lack of clarity on that issue, I think has left people like really frustrated. And so it's just like, here's just another thing that we're taking
Yeah.
an L on, right? Like, so I feel like a lot of people kind of feel that sentiment.
There hasn't been that much like positive news in the recent months. Like, I mean, I just recently thought about that as I was like mentally starting to prepare for German Nats in like 2 or 3 weeks, and I was like, damn, I haven't played a major event in over 6 months at this point. Like, because YCS Bologna was like over 6 months ago. Like, it was the start of December, and that's the last time I haven't played in that long outside of COVID was like in 2011 or something, or 2010 even.
Yeah. The last YCS was 4 years ago. That's crazy. All right. Anyway, let's jump into our main topic today. Let's move in. We're talking side decking today. So,
Yes.
the side decking is a huge part of Yu-Gi-Oh! It is a massive part of the game that you will probably notice when you're at locals, when you're watching people play. Basically, people, whenever they sit down to have 4 fun games or quick duels versus friends or whatever, people just kind of like have this kind of sort of unwritten rule that, yeah, we just play best of one, game ones kind of thing. And side decking is kind of an afterthought. Once you get to the competitive level, for a lot of players, again, even like good players, sometimes side decking can be a big afterthought. Side decking is such an important fundamental aspect of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! That it's something that you need to think about, you need to practice, and you need to deck build around. If you just think about it at the very minimum like this, at a minimum, 50% of every single game of Yu-Gi-Oh! You play competitively is with a side deck. So that's how important it is. And even more so, if you go to game 3, then 66% of your duels are played with side decks. And so it's a really important thing to get good at, to practice and think about, which hopefully we're going to get some good instructions and tips on how to actually approach this.
Yeah, I mean, it really is very, very important, especially because you're changing like a large portion of your deck potentially on the way, like when you go from game 1 to game 2. I'd say the most common numbers to side deck nowadays is like somewhere between 3 and maybe 9 cards or whatever is like usually the max that you would do. But it's like it's a substantial portion of your deck that you're switching around between games. And technically the side deck it's even more important if you consider that you have way more information going into game 2 and 3 than you have before you start the match, right? You're building your main deck with or like you're going into game 1 with very little information because you don't know who's going to be able to go first, you don't know what your opponent is playing, you don't know how your opponent is playing, which kind of cards are in their deck, which kind of tech choices they've made. A lot of things that you find out in game 1, right? You're going to see the deck that they're playing, you're going to see some of the cards that they chose to run. You know who won the first game, so you know who gets to decide on who starts game 2. And so it's a lot of information that you get that if your side deck is not properly built, you can't make good use of that information. It's basically throwing away a lot of potential advantages going into game 2 and game 3, because you can only act on that information if your side deck is like built correctly.
And even before that point, when you are building your side deck, I think a big mistake that people make is kind of just put in like, here's some like good generic cards that work versus Snake Eye versus Tenpai, and then maybe like a couple of other meta decks, and then that's kind of done. I think one of the most important things that I would give as advice is to think about side patterns. Now, what a side pattern is you shouldn't, and you see this so often, sometimes people like pick up their decks in between games and they're thinking about what they're siding, which is not really something you should be doing, because that's something you should have pre-planned. You should know, versus this matchup, these cards come out, these cards go in. That's a really important thing, and I think something that players need to think about more is you need to really pre-plan these things and decide what cards are coming in and out for first and second.
Especially when it's against like top tier decks, right? I think there is a level of low popularity to a certain deck that where I think it's okay to not have the side patterns memorized for like all 20 decks that you might encounter in the current format or whatever. But especially for the higher tier decks, the ones that you're definitely expecting to play against at a tournament, you should be knowing your side decking patterns, and honestly, you should be building your. Maybe sometimes you make changes to your main deck because your side decking patterns don't work out. Sometimes you change your side deck because the way your side deck is currently built doesn't make sense because you can't take out enough cards in a certain matchup or whatever, right? And so like, it is something that often, if you think about your siding patterns, it can have like you make changes in retrospect to a deck that maybe you thought was done, but then you realize it doesn't quite work out post side decking because let's say I really like I don't know, some cards in the main deck. Let's say I really like Nibiru and what's another good example? Nibiru and Ghost Ogre in my main deck. I wanted to play 6 copies, but then I can't really justify that because there's a couple matchups where I need to side out all of those 6 cards, but I can't fit 6 cards that go in for those matchups. So that's a sort of consolation that maybe you can't, you just can't do that, right?
Yeah, I think
If those
against like
matchups are popular enough, like if yeah.
Yeah, I think like as you mentioned, you know, you can't obviously have a plan for every deck in the game. That's just natural. But focusing more on the aspect of specifically the meta, for example, right? It's important to think about like uh, the differences between go first and go second. Now, again, having some examples here would probably work out. So let's say you're side decking Bestials this format, for example. You don't really feel like it's worth main decking, but it's something that you want to put in your side deck. You can bring in Bestials, probably more likely to go second against something like Snake Eye. Now, if you're taking cards out, there is a good chance that you would have taken out cards that are still good in that matchup. But then you kind of have to ask yourself, well, okay, well, why am I side decking more cards for Snake Eye if I've tailored my main deck to it? So that's why the focus on patterns and what you're bringing in and out is really important. And further than that, when you're going second, there's a really simple mistake, but hopefully I think a lot of people don't really do this anymore. Sometimes people will bring in go first cards for a second. What I mean by that is sometimes you'll see people who think like, you know, class format, for example, Summon Limit. Summon Limit is a good card, it stops you. But if you think about it, that's not going to help you going second. You've already established, your opponent's already establishing their field, and so setting a trap and waiting doesn't really make sense. It seems obvious, but I think a lot of newer players, especially when they get into the game and they talk about side decking and they think about side decking, it's just a case of, let me bring in these cards in this matchup because they seem good, rather than really focusing on what the practical application of those cards are. Am I going first? Am I going second?
I mean, the entire reason why people put those cards in their side deck most of the time rather than their main deck is because of how bad they are at going second, right? You constantly see people seeing those cards and thinking like, oh, how powerful these cards can be, especially when you go first, and then wanting to put them into their main deck for that extra extra power when you go first. But usually, because you don't have the info of whether you're going to be able to start game 1 or not, those cards are better off in the side deck because you only want them when you go first. And even then, there's another thing. You have to juggle so many questions when you're building a side deck. But generally, you definitely want to fix some of the issues that your deck has. Like it's a very broad statement, but like you have to identify the kind of issues that your deck has, and you want to solve them. And in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, a lot of the times, going first is already something that is very, very strong. Like going first is the standard, the golden standard in Yu-Gi-Oh. Most decks outside of Tenpai Dragon at the moment want to go first and are good at going first. And so the question you always have to ask yourself is, do I want to put more cards for going first into my deck when it's already what my deck is good at, quote unquote, right? And so in specifically Snake Eyes at the moment, I think the reason why people are still playing cards like Skill Drain now that Summon Limit is banned, is that you're expecting your opponent to use a bunch of hand traps. So if you draw a card like Skill Drain, that can like protect you from everything your opponent does. Like let's say they hand trap you 2 or 3 times, so they probably can't play through a Skill Drain, and then on the next turn you just keep playing by sending the Skill Drain with like Snake Eye Ash and just continue. On the other hand, you could also be siding a card like Crossout or whatever instead of the Skill Drain and just play through their hand traps or whatever it is, right? But basically by putting in cards for going first, you are sacrificing room to either cover going second more or cover more matchups in general, when going first is probably something that your deck should already be good enough at as it is. So I tend to often not side deck cards for going first. It's usually I would say it's an exception, and if I do it, it's only very few.
It's really interesting that you mentioned the go first aspect, because that's typically when your deck is strongest.
Yeah.
And when your deck is at its strongest is when it's consistent. And I think sometimes moving on to sort of this next aspect I wanted to bring up is
Mhm.
oversiding. Sometimes what people can do is you think that Snake Eye is like this crazy, terrible matchup for you, which makes sense. But there comes to a point where there's just physically nothing you can take out without hindering your win condition. So what I mean by that is sometimes people will start taking out things like engine pieces, like really important engine pieces.
Mhm.
Um, citing things out like Pot of Desires, Small World, Pot of Prosperity. These are consistency pieces that when you're going first, you probably should still be keeping those cards in because they actually help you play your deck. And I think one of the mistakes that people can do is overside.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like I do think siding out engine pieces can be okay. It can even be necessary because sometimes a certain matchup just requires you to have a certain amount of answers to certain cards, and you need to adjust your deck accordingly. This is something that depends heavily on what kind of deck you're playing. Some decks can be built like to be hyper consistent for game one. Like game one, you want to have like the max amount of engine, and then for game two, you can afford to take out some engine pieces because your deck is still super consistent, right? Consistent is a very subjective term, right? It's like you can get into the math behind it. At the end of the day, you have to know what you're happy with in terms of consistency because every deck can theoretically break. Just are you happy with a 90% chance of being able to play? Are you happy with an 80% chance of being able to play? It's all up to the player. Generally, what I've been doing is with most of my decks, I haven't really been siding out engine when going first, because usually the decks you build your main deck to perform going first and going second, right? Because you don't know what's going to happen in game one. So usually my main decks are built in a way where I'm happy with the consistency going first with 5 cards, right? What that means is that when I know I'm going to go second, and I was already happy with my consistency with 5 cards, it's realistic that I can take out a couple of engine pieces because I know I'm going to get that extra card, right? I know I'm going to be able to play with 6 cards. So if I was happy with the consistency in 5 cards, I might be able to take 1 or 2 engine pieces out if I have to, right? And that's another thing. I do that if I have to. I don't do that if I have other options. Like for example, I did that with Runic Bestial because that deck is basically all engine, right? There's not that much non-engine in the Runic decks most of the time. Like going first, I wouldn't really change anything, even if a card was really good in a certain matchup, right? I would play a card in the deck for a specific matchup. I play that matchup. Let's say I lose game one. I might not change anything about my deck because I just want it to stay that way. I'm happy with it going first. And the card that's dedicated for this matchup, I'm still not going to put it in because I can't really change my deck going first. But going second, I can take out some engine pieces for the card.
And I think engine pieces is also can sometimes feel like a misleading term. So if we take like if we have like an example here, um, when you're playing, let's say for example, Pearly, there's basically never ever going to be a situation where you side out my friend. You're basically never going to side out any of the quick plays. But in theory, potentially, you could maybe think to yourself, okay, going first, we could side out a copy of Street. That's an engine piece, but not an engine consistency piece that actually gets you to where you're going. Perhaps going first, that targeting protection might not be as important. So just as a small example of that kind of gray area of what an engine card actually is and what you can afford to take out and what you can afford to take in. Because that targeting protection, for example, might be way more valuable playing into a board than it is going first.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, once again, that depends on the format. Like if you're going first in a format where everyone is on Effect Veiler and Impermanence, like right now, you might want to consider keeping those streets in. But if it's a format where people are mostly on like board breakers or something, like for example in Unchained format, I think going first it was absolutely reasonable to go down to one street when you knew you were going to go first, right? And you wanted some stuff in your side deck for going first. If you had anything, right? Maybe you don't have anything and you just keep the street, but it always depends on the environment. And I saw another question in chat just a moment ago, which asked about siding extra deck cards, which I guess is another topic we can quickly go over. I think side decking extra deck cards is a tool that is probably overall underused, even though you don't want to do it very often. You need to have very specific reasons for it. But the possibility to adjust your extra deck for specific situations, I think, is valuable, and I think it's very often overlooked. But I would, at that point, you have to value what's more important, like the ability to put actual cards for your main deck in your side, or an extra deck piece, because you could be putting that card into the extra deck. So that's something I would usually only do or recommend when your extra deck is really, really tight. Because
Yeah.
usually you want to maximize the amount of cards you can change for different matchups.
Yeah, as far as extra deck goes, there's like a lot of very good extra deck cards that may not potentially see play in the main deck. Abyss Dweller, for example, is a really good example where you might be in a format where you just don't feel like Dweller is really that necessary in the main deck, but you know that if you get paired against this third best deck in the game that is kind of popular, but you still need a lot of that main deck extra, that's an option for when you go first. You can bring in Dweller, and that's an option for you. Although be careful when you're siding, because one of the most annoying things that probably the reason I don't side deck extra deck cards as much as I used to, you have to keep your extra deck cards in your main deck sleeves, but then side into your extra deck. It's just like
you have to change sleeves basically, because your side deck has to be all of the same sleeves, same as your extra deck. So you can't, like, let's say you're using red sleeves for the extra deck and white sleeves for the main deck and side deck. You can't put the extra deck card into your side deck in a red sleeve. It has to be a white sleeve, and then when you're siding, you have to swap the sleeves, which can be be very annoying.
It's also very easy to telegraph to your opponent as well when they see
they
you.
They will notice. Yes, they will definitely notice. The other thing is the Dweller is a perfect example of when the knowledge changes between game 1 and game 2, because Dweller might be a card in a format where there's like only a couple graveyard-centric decks. You might never feel comfortable doing that going first when you don't know what your opponent's playing, right? So you might ask yourself, like, why is this card here when I'm not ever making it going first, because I don't know if it's good against my opponent's deck, right? Well, after siding, you will know. So it's a very good example of a card that you could consider side decking if your main deck space is very valuable, and but you still want to cover some matchups with it.
Another point I wanted to ask you about was so talking about going second, rather than the specifics of like, hey, this card is good going second. One important thing and one interesting thing is that when you go second, you have an extra card in your hand. This can change the percentages and the maths behind some of those go second cards. Because for those of you who have ever fooled around with the hypergeometric calculations, you'll know that any 3-of that you open in your opening 5-card hand is a 33% chance. Going second, that gets boosted to around about 38%. So potentially, that math could affect certain ratios if you know you're going second. If you want to get really deep into the side decking, I've seen, for example, people who cut down on a normal summon if you're going second. The reason for that being is you now have 6 cards in your hand. That is kind of likely to clog you because you don't want multiple normal summons in your hand. Now, obviously, that doesn't feel as applicable these days because normal summons like a Snake Eye Ash, like, yeah, you could clog on 2 Ash, but you want to see Ash regardless because it's just a 1-card combo. That just makes sense. But there are times when going second, we're not talking about the specific cards that you're bringing for going inside, like Lightning Storm, but how do these numbers manipulate and change card types, like board breakers, like normal summons, etc., when you go second, and how do you like side deck and adapt to that?
That it definitely this falls into the category of what we talked about earlier, of how I find it way more reasonable to take out engine pieces when you go second, because your deck should be built for game 1 if you're playing a going first deck. Your deck should be built to be consistent in 5 cards, always, right? Because you need to be prepared when you go first to have a playable hand, right? Most of the time. So that being said, if your deck is built like that, like if you have a properly built main deck for game 1, that means you can either just keep the amount of like starter cards or whatever you want to call it. You can keep it in side decking and basically be even safer, because you get that 6th card, right? You're gonna have that extra percentage of not bricking, because instead of 5 cards you get 6 cards, or you can afford to take out 1 or 2 openers into like board breakers or whatever. And another thing that's worth mentioning on the same note is there's a big difference in between hand traps and board breakers in general, because the board breakers are usually very good if you pick them up as card number 6, or if you pick them up off of a Pot of Prosperity or other draw cards that might be in your deck or might not be in your deck. And hand traps usually don't do anything if you pick them up after your opponent has finished their turn, right? And that's another big reason why a lot of the times people will side deck these cards for going second, rather than main decking them. Outside of the fact that hand traps are still better when you go first because they can still back up your board rather than something like a Dark Ruler or a Lightning Storm, which doesn't do anything when you go first, right? But the fact that they give you extra chances of drawing them when you go second rather than hand traps, which need to be in your opening 5, I think is also a big deal.
Yeah. When I first heard this, it was a bit of a eureka moment because it's generally thought of as like, here's some good go second cards. You put those in going second. But the idea that you now have an extra card in your hand does actually affect the ratios and maths of your deck. So it's something for people to think about when doing your side decking. Last point I think I wanted to talk about for specifically siding specifically is the idea of counter siding. One thing that I saw that was like absolutely crazy back in 2022, I think it was. It might have just been how down bad branded players are. But when you understand and see that your deck has such a fundamental, like, important line of play with, for example, branded fusion, people were side decking, like, for going second, crossouts, and one copy of D-Barrier. Or even we saw people playing Epsilon. Is Epsilon the trap one or the spell one? There's a spell one that you can use to negate.
I think it's Epsilon.
Sorry, the trap one. Yeah, the trap one to negate the D-Barrier, for example. This is something that people were actually doing because of just how important it was. So yeah, what do you think about counter siding? Specifically,
not something I would do very often. It needs to be a very drastic situation like the one that you're describing. Like the format you're talking about, it was literally you could literally, I would think like 90% of people had D-Barrier in their side deck in that format, like Sword Soul branded format kind of thing. Like everyone was playing it, and the deck completely hard lost to it. Like you couldn't play the game if that card was flipped on you. So I think it was reasonable to do that, right? A more like, I guess a more realistic example for the current format, I guess, is like siding cards like back row removal into a matchup that you normally wouldn't really side back row removal in, because you are expecting people to side deck floodgates for going first, which is a very common thing in, for example, Snake Eyes at the moment, which I think we saw all kinds of, like, people are playing Skill Drain, people are playing Deck Lockdown, people are replacing Summon Limit with other things, basically. Right? And there's still the one of anti-spell going around in people's decks, right? And so the question you have to ask yourself is always, basically, we're talking opportunity cost here. Like, if I want to put a Cosmic Cyclone into my deck to be safe from a potential skill drain, that's potentially an okay idea, right? The problem is that you might just lose to the regular Snake Eye end board if you draw a Cosmic and no other cards to combat it, right? So you have to think about, like, what could that Cosmic be instead? You know, is it worth having an out to skill drain in my deck when I might not have sufficient ways to deal with the main thing that deck does, right? And I think the same thing is true when you look at branded and crossout, right? Like, the question is like, okay, well, I might be able to counter the D-Barrier, but do I have enough tools to deal with the thing that the deck does, right? And in Branded's case, it was usually the case. Like, in Branded, the answer was always, yeah, if I force through my Branded fusion, I can probably win the game, right? So in that case, it was reasonable. I think if you're playing something like, I don't know, like, let's say Voiceless Voice at the moment, I don't think it's reasonable to side Cosmic Cyclone against Skill Drain, because chances are you need all the cards in your hand to just deal with the Snake Eye stuff in the first place, right? But yeah, you don't have the capability to rely on a Cosmic Cyclone. Like, it's just a matter of, you just gotta hope they don't have the Skill Drain, which I know it sucks, but sometimes that is also part of deck building, is accepting that you can't deal with every single situation every single time. Like, sometimes there are certain things, if they happen, you lose the game.
Yeah, and I think it's a good term you brought up, is opportunity cost, because when you think about every possible situation you could be in against a combo deck, you don't want to have back row hate typically, but you kind of had to. And I think we saw the worst of that dilemma when Mystic Mine was around, right? When you're trying to beat a combo deck, but you're also having to, like, run the risk of running into Mystic Mine in that same situation. So
especially, it was like going first. You were playing against a combo deck, and you were like expected to put like Feather Duster in your deck or something, because they might just like let you play and then activate Mystic Mine. It was a bizarre situation, because it's just, I'm still waiting for a good main deckable card that is both a good standalone card and also out to like floodgates, that'd be sick.
Does anything like that exist? I'm trying to think.
Runic Destruction.
How does that out monster issues?
Well, freezing curses.
Now you're just naming different runics.
Yes.
The idea of hybrid cards is really cool because I think one of my favorites is I think Necros used to like occasionally side deck Archfiend Eccentric, which was kind of nice.
Yeah,
Because you could use it to it's a hybrid card for anyone who doesn't know. It's a pendulum monster which has the scale effect that you can I think tribute it from your scale or send it, whatever the wording is, to pop a back row. But you could also normal summon it to pop a monster. So it was this nice little hybrid card, which I don't think we have anything like that these days. That's that sort of two in one type of card.
I mean, there's a bunch of those, but they're just not good enough, right? That's the thing.
Yeah.
I would like to see like a utility card like that. I do think, unfortunately, if you're talking, you're not gonna like to hear it, but the most generic one that we and closest to playable is probably Fenrir.
Oh! Yeah, exactly. That's the one. Is there anything else we want to talk about for first and second?
Just specifically for first and second, no, I don't think there's anything I need to add. I think we covered it good enough.
So if you guys hopefully got a good amount of pointers and understandings of how you side going first and second, then that's good to hear. So next, I'd like to talk about, it's a bit of a minor strategy per se, but it's something that I think Tenpai is the one that is popularizing it. It's this idea of smoke screening.
Yeah.
So for those of you who don't know what smoke screening is, it's the idea where you dedicate 15 dedicated engine pieces from an archetype that you bring in to basically swap your deck into a different deck. One of the first examples that saw some kind of success back in the day was in 2011, I think it was. We had Inzectors combining itself with Chainburn. Now, what you would do is you would play Chainburn for game 1. You could win, you could lose, whatever. It's Chainburn. And then in game 2, you essentially side a full Inzector engine, taking out a lot of those burn cards, because a lot of the trap cards had some crossover. You would still play things like Threatening Roar and Exector because it was important to like let your guy survive for a turn, then do an equip, then etc. etc. But then what you've done here is you've completely shattered your opponent's side deck for you. So when they bring in like all of this back row hate for things like Chainburn, now they have a board of monsters to deal with. We saw this in 2014 as well. There was a couple of people who tried smoke screening between Bujin and Fire Fist. Your opponent would bring in Light Imprisoning Mirror for your Bujin cards, and then you would normal summon, Fire Fist, Bear, and Dragon, etc., etc. So this is a strategy we've seen popularized recently. I think Labyrinth is the best crossover with Tenpai, where essentially you play a trap deck.
Yeah.
And then you swap into an OTK strategy going second.
It's very funny because it hasn't been viable in so long, and even in the cases that you mentioned, I think there's more. But I also I don't remember that many. I did that at a YCS once, by the way. I entered a YCS.
You smoke screened?
Yeah, I smoke screened.
Josh, playing runics and then like playing other runics isn't smoke screening. Okay?
That is not what I'm referring to. This is like 13 years ago at this point. It's YCS Toulouse, I think 2011 or 2012. I did not do very well, but the idea that I had was my main deck was Rabbit, which was there was still priority, and so people would.
What is Rabbit? Is that just like the
Rescue Rabbit, Dino Rabbit?
So it's like the Lagia turbo shit, right?
Yeah. It's like Rabbit, Tour Guide, Vanillas, good stuff, spell traps and all that, and then so the idea that I had was because both Maxi and Effect Veiler were not very good against Rabbit at the time, because Veiler wasn't good because priority still existed, if I remember correctly. Like you would normal summon Rabbit, use priority, you couldn't Veiler it. And Maxi wasn't very good because the deck, I mean, against Rabbit specifically, Maxi was a +1, but against every other like opener, the card would just sit in your hand, because very often the deck would just normal summon Sabersaurus or Cabazals, or Tour Guide into Sangan would give you an upstart goblin out of your Maxi. Or it's crazy to think about from today's perspective that Maxi wasn't good, but Maxi was not good in that matchup. Like people would take out Maxi for like cards like Soul Taker or whatever. Those were popular just to like bait the Lagia or Dolka negate. That was better, right? And my idea was, well, the Rescue Rabbit package is relatively small. It's just like Rabbit and the vanillas and some good stuff, spell and traps. You do the same thing in Wind Up, but Wind Up is very bad against Maxia and Effect Veiler. So what I did was I took out the Rabbits and the vanillas. I kept the Tour Guide because that was good in both matchups, in both decks. And I just sided in a Wind Up package, like Factory, Magician, Shark, one Hunter, three rats or whatever. And I felt very smart. And I don't think it was that bad.
That's the takeaway here. I felt very intelligent.
But I didn't do very well.
Oh no. What happened? Like, what do you think went wrong? Was it like the strategy itself, or was it just like
I don't actually remember that well. At the same time, I was 15. So maybe that.
So you were very smart for 15.
Maybe I just didn't play it very well, but I don't remember. I went X3 day 1. I don't remember much more.
Average Smokescreen result.
Yeah. But I've tried it at a YCS at least. I thought it was a good idea, so I went with it. So yeah, but just to elaborate the concept a little bit more. But yeah, just to get back to current days, I think it's very funny that Tenpai Dragon is a deck that doesn't have more than 15 engine pieces, doesn't need more than 15 engine pieces, funnily enough. And so what I've seen is someone playing a Labyrinth deck, which is basically just Furniture Labyrinth with a lot of hand traps, which is what you would play anyways in this format. And they have just made the effort of, normally you play a little bit more than 15 Labyrinth cards, I think. But they've like narrowed it down a little bit to like, it's just a bunch of furnitures. Maybe they cut down on Arianas. It's definitely only one Lady, one Lovely. Only one Welcome Lab. Like basically, so it's like exactly 15 Labyrinth cards. Pair that up with like some pots and some hand traps or some other non-engine in the main deck, and you have a functioning Labyrinth deck, right? It might be slightly less consistent than a normal Labyrinth deck if you play all of the Welcome Labs or whatever, but it's a functioning deck, right? And then obviously Labyrinth wants to go first, and your opponent wants to go first if they see that you're playing Labyrinth. And so the idea is you take out all those Labyrinth cards for all the Tenpai cards, and you just like stomp your opponent when they go first. And it's funny, and it's kind of interesting in a way that I didn't look at it and I thought it was like only a gimmick or completely terrible. I could see people lose to that. Like I could see that being an actual strategy. The only problem is that like you are super unflexible, right? Like you don't have any other cards in your side deck. You can't side matchup specific. If you have a card in your main deck that is bad in a certain matchup, you can't take it out, because what are you going to keep in your deck? Like one Stovey Torby? Good luck with that. Like you have to take out all of the Labyrinth cards every time. If one of the hand traps you play is bad in a matchup, you can't take that one out either. Like it has to stay. So it's a really volatile strategy, but the payoff if you build a deck like that accordingly could be huge. Granted that people don't know about it at some point. Like if you do that in a large tournament at some point, people are gonna know, and then it's like a even bigger mind game. Yeah, but it's funny.
Yeah, so I think the theory on paper, it sounds like really smart, right? Because you're kind of trying to checkmate your opponent, because if they make you start, they risk you just having Labyrinth cards. If they go first, they risk just dying to Tenpai cards. So in a theoretical sense, it sounds like, you know, you are trying to corner your opponent into this like prisoner's dilemma type of philosophical problem. But yeah, I think as you mentioned, like the cracks really start to show once you are either playing against uncertain matchups or less common matchups, and then you have like a bunch of really bad cards in your main deck. Particularly hand traps, I think, is like the biggest thing, right? Is the main crossover these days, and hand traps are going to be terrible against some decks. And then likewise as well, as you get deeper into a tournament, people start to notice and pick up on who's kind of playing what, and then you become the Lab Tenpai player by like you know round 8, and then it's like, well. That's not much of a surprise anymore, right? So people kind of catch on.
It's at its best when you win game 1, because then you don't have that mind game, right? Because you can just like, you win game 1 with Labyrinth, and I think then you just like, if the mind game works, your opponent is gonna, it's not really a mind game, it's gonna work. Like your opponent is gonna go first, right? And then you're just gonna most likely be able to win with Tenpai if they're not prepared for it. The problem is if you lose game 1, right? Then you have to like basically not side deck at all, play game 2 with the same deck, or side deck into Tenpai, make your opponent start, and then even if it works and you win game 2, you have to go into game 3 with that mind game, right? And the thing is, forcing your opponent into a mind game is not only a good thing, right? Because it's basically a 50-50 that you might win, but you also could lose that 50-50 because you might think like, okay, he's gonna go first or they're gonna go first. I'm gonna play the Tenpai card, and then they just say, yeah, you go first. And then you've lost the mind game, you've lost the 50-50, and that's basically GG the other way, right? So yeah, I think it's a very funny thought experiment, but I think at a very large competitive scale, I don't think it can work. But especially at like a smaller scale, I wouldn't be surprised if that sort of thing could like top or win a regional, for sure.
Don't at me, but if my opponent makes me go first with Tenpai, I think that Seal's Pass is better than a Labyrinth opening. That's my hot take.
I mean, dude, if your opponent has an Ash Blossom, I'd rather be playing Tenpai as well, I think.
Yeah, so I think that does it for the side decking portion of things. Now we're going to talk a little bit about side decking as a concept. This is going to involve a lot of crazy hot takes here and some thought experiments and debates, so this should be exciting. Let's begin with side decking as a concept. This idea that you play a game of best of 3, you bring in cards going first or second. It sounds like a good idea in theory. This you're going to have like cards that are just not good against certain matchups. Like Effect Veiler, Imperm, that might not really help you that much against something like Labyrinth. And so it's better to bring cards in. And what you're doing is you're filling the cracks with the weaknesses of your deck and your matchups with your side deck. Conversely, what basically happens a lot in Yu-Gi-Oh, unfortunately, is the side deck essentially is getting abused in such a way that you're trying to make your opponent have as miserable of a time as possible. Do we think that's good? And one of the things that we talked about in the last podcast that I think really kind of gave me this interesting eureka moment was Raran. Funnily enough, we're talking about deep competitive side decking theory, and I'm referencing Raran. He brought up this point where when a card game is designed, are you designing it for the player or are you designing it for the opponent? And I think side decking, and Yu-Gi-Oh in general, I feel like is very much sort of tailored to the player. In that the sense is you are trying to create as many opportunities in your side deck for the player to have an upper hand rather than the opponent. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that we're denigrating a lot of the side decking problems with the fact that when you're side decking for going first or going second, it's almost always these like game-winning auto-win buttons. Is this a good thing?
So, yeah, I wanted to look at this from the perspective, like I wanted to definitely say that conceptually, I think the side deck is a great thing. I think it's a very, very good concept. But I don't know if this is going to be an unpopular opinion or not, because I've seen some people in chat already say the same thing. But I personally think that the way the side deck is being used in Yu-Gi-Oh nowadays is basically what you described. Is like you have instead of people just like slightly adjusting their deck to be better in a specific matchup, which is how it was used back in the day, right? You would like maybe have like an MST in your main deck or a Heavy Storm for a matchup that didn't have a lot of back row. You would take it out for a slightly better card, which is completely reasonable and fine. Instead, nowadays, a lot of the time, people are putting in D-Barrier against a deck that only relies on fusion summoning, or they're putting in Skill Drain when they know they go first, or they put in like an abnormal amount of like board breakers when they know they're going to go second. Like people throw in like Lightning Storm evenly, Dark Ruler no more, and all that kind of stuff for when they go second. So in practice, it's like game 2 and game 3, I feel like the percentage of games that are quote unquote non-games because they're just like decided by certain blowout cards, let it be going first or second, I think that percentage is a lot higher if you compare it to game 1. The only thing that is like quote unquote blowout / variance about game 1 is who's able to go first, who wins that dice roll, right? But a lot of those cards, a lot of the most toxic cards that people complain about are often located in the side deck. Sometimes in the extra deck, but I feel like a lot of the times we complain about side deck and extra deck cards way more than we complain about main deck cards. Not to say that there aren't any main deck cards worth complaining about, but I think generally the side deck is a bigger culprit of introducing these kind of cards than the main deck.
I think that an interesting question to answer is, let's say we delete side decking. Does the game get better?
I mean, at this point, you're basically just playing 3 separate best of ones that aren't really connected. Like, you have to build your deck without knowing whether you're going to go first or second. So it's basically like playing 3 games of Master Duel back to back to back. So I don't think it necessarily gets better.
Oh god, hell no! Don't make me do that.
Exactly. I don't know. It's tough. I think in general, this ties into, that's why I told you beforehand, I wanted to talk about this entire best of 3 topic of like, best of 3, is best of 3 even the best possible way to play a match of Yu-Gi-Oh these days? Because there's a lot of these factors that happen after game 1 that kind of make the games feel worse than game 1s, right? Like, because you have side deck cards coming in from both ends. Like, the player going second is going to side blowouts for going second. The player going first is going to side blowouts for going first. And then it's just a matter of, the chances are high that one of the two is going to see those cards and the game feels like a non-game. And then you have the whole time issue as well going into it, right? Whereas, like, it's nowadays very, very common that you don't finish the full 3 games in 45 minutes, and that often makes game 3 feel very weird and not like an actual Yu-Gi-Oh game. And it's like, if it all feels like it's just an extension to game 1, because whoever wins game 1 is so much more likely to win the match anyways, right? Because you get to go first in game 3, you have the chance to blow out your opponent going second, you have more control about what happens when it's closer to time, because you can scoop game 2 whenever you feel like it, right? You have more control over that. You can go first if there's like 2 minutes left on the clock. All these kinds of things make it feel like game 1 is the most important game anyways, the one where the most Yu-Gi-Oh is being played anyways, and that begs the question of, like, do we even need best of 3 to determine a winner, right? And then I think it's very interesting because the Pokemon community has I saw the very same discussion over Twitter the last couple days, where they were like, you know what, we have these time rules, but our matches never finish anyways in 45 or 50 minutes or whatever it is. So whoever wins game 1 is so much more likely to win the game. I think it's a little different for them because in Pokemon, it's even worse, I think, to an extent, because if their game doesn't finish in time, the entire game doesn't count, basically. Like, let's say it's 1-1 and it's time, they have a couple extra turns. If the game doesn't fully finish, the game it's still a draw. Even if you're ahead, like, by you have 1 prize card left, your opponent has all 6. If the game doesn't finish, it's a draw. And the same is true if you're up 1 game. If game 2 goes into time, even if the other player is completely ahead, you still win. Even if your opponent would win the next turn, it's still your game, right? And so it's like the player going first is just like heavily incentivized, I guess, to not hurry in game 2 and just let it go to time or whatever.
Yeah, that sounds horrible, by the way.
It is, yes. And that's another thing that they're complaining about. But they've basically been saying, like, what we're playing feels like best of 1 decides the winner anyways. And everything else is just like, it's just formalities, basically. We have to, like, keep playing, but technically already won, or like whatever, right? And then they were like, I wish we could go back to best of 1, because they don't have a side deck anyways, to be fair. But, like, yeah. And then someone mentioned that Lorcana has best of 2, which sounds crazy if you think about it, because it doesn't make any sense, because you don't have a clear winner. But the way it works in Lorcana, apparently, is they just play 2 games where each player is allowed to go first once. There's no coin flip or anything. It's just like, you go first once, I go first once. And then it's just a matter of, I think if you win both games, you get 2 points. If you each win 1, you each get 1 point. And that's it.
That's kind of fascinating.
I think it is. I like when I heard that for a first time, I thought that was actually very intriguing. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, 1 point per win, and then both players get a chance to go first, I think is quite interesting. I assume there's no side deck, right?
I don't think they have a side deck, but that is not something I'm 100% con. That might be incorrect.
Yeah, because like I feel like if you have side decking it in a best of two, that becomes really toxic, and I think you just have the same problems as you did before, which is best of
You
one
definitely still
is
have problems, yeah.
yeah. Um, yeah. How does it work in Top Cut? I'm actually interested. Does anyone know? Do
I
you
would
know?
assume they just upgrade to best of 3 in Top Cut, but that is just a guess.
Oh, just straight up change the structure. Okay, interesting. Best of two in Yu-Gi-Oh! Wow. Okay, well, I mean that could be an interesting tournament to try, test, and play out. Maybe.
It's just a concept that I've never even heard of before. Like I've never even heard of a best of 2 like for Swiss, but like technically it's true. The fact that we have draws, like we don't need to define a winner every time if it's to the detriment of the system or the game, right? Like if I don't know, like I think sometimes I think to myself, like for example, if we finish game 2 and it's 1-1 and it's like there's 3 minutes left on the clock, very often I feel like it would be better to just call this a draw than enter this hell of a game 3 that's about to be for one of for maybe either it's terrible for both players or it's terrible for one player. I don't know. It always feels weird to enter a game 3 with like a couple minutes left, and so I would feel like, you know, let's if we could just call it a draw right there by the rules, like 3 minutes before timer ends or whatever, I'd be okay with that.
I think that it really kind of it's interesting because this whole topic really does beg the question of some of the major flaws of Yu-Gi-Oh, which is like I think best of one being so heavily skewed in favor of, and also the time rules, and it just feels like specifically with the time rules, the side deck patterns or the side deck cards that you bring in, and when you choose to scoop in game two, it feels like it's unlosable in some ways, right? Because if you have that game one win, if your deck is able to just play game two and then, you know, bring in a very consistent time card, you know, your deck back in Runic Sprite format was really good at that because you had Red Resonator, and so you just set up a red or a carrot to protect and insulate from any kind of disruption. You make sure that Resonator goes through, you gain life, and then it feels impossible to really do anything about that. And I think Yu-Gi-Oh can really struggle with this idea, and I don't know like what the fix is without just like I don't know. You would have to basically uproot a lot of the systems of how side decking works.
I guess, yeah. And I just thought like maybe this Lorcana system, even though it sounds very wild when you hear about it for the first time, but I just thought to myself, what if we had like let's imagine a tournament structure where you have you play 2 games against each other. Each player is allowed to go first once, and we just don't have a side deck. So you basically have to build your deck to be able to go first once and go second the other game. You're never going to be able to go first twice or go second twice in a match, right? You always have to go first or go second. So you have to like kind of balance your deck around that. Like if you make your deck only good going first, then you're gonna lose the game going second always. If you build your deck for only going second, you're always gonna lose the match that you have to go first. Maybe that'd be okay. Maybe that'd be an interesting thing to at least try, and then just like slap 40 minutes on that, so you have 20 minutes per game, which is more than the 15 minutes per game now. So it's overall.
Do you think you would have 2 separate time rules? Like, do you think like it would be 40 minutes total, or do you think it would be like 20-20?
Like 20 minutes for game 1, 20 minutes for game 2?
Yeah, I think maybe that would be the easiest way to keep it fair, potentially, right?
I guess if there was an easy way to try, I guess that would be possible. You could just be like, yeah, 20 minutes time on the round for game 1, then give them like a minute to set up game 2, start the timer again. It'd be possible, yeah.
Yeah, but I think like in terms of like coming back to reality, and focusing on like the practical ways of actually addressing some of the issues that toxic siding can create, and best of 3 as a concept, I think it really feels like the most egregious, annoying ways that best of 3 is going to feel is when those floodgates come in, especially in situations where you play against Snake Eye and they activate like deck lockdown. That feels like very frustrating.
this sort of situation is so surreal because you were like, the thing is, losing to a skill drain by Snake Eyes or losing to a deck lockdown by Snake Eyes is never your fault, right? Like, people will say like, oh well, you should have sided an out, but in reality of things, like, beating Snake Eyes is already hard enough as it is. Beating Snake Eyes while also having to have like a Cosmic Cyclone in hand and having to deal with what they do when they go first, it's just unreasonable. It's not reasonable to ask of a player to prepare for Snake Eyes, which is already incredibly hard, but then also have the out to skill drain or whatever. It's just not reasonable. And I want to say, on a more positive note, the side decks are not exclusively being used for degenerate cards, right? That is just, it's like more of an exaggeration or like something that can happen and does happen, but it's like, to a large extent, the side deck is still being used to swap out some mediocre cards in a matchup into some solid cards in a matchup. Like, we still see cards like Cosmic Cyclone being cited, which is a completely fair Yu-Gi-Oh card. It's just not good in every matchup or in every situation. So you put it in your side deck for the situations where it is good, and it is one of the more popular side deck staples these days, right? And that's something that's, I think, an example that deserves to be brought up of a card where the side deck provides a lot of value to the game, right? Because that card often shouldn't be main decked, but having it in the side deck feels really nice for a lot of matchups, right? And I think the problem is that these negative examples like D-Barrier, Skill Drain, whatever, always attract way more attention than the cases where cards are being used in a cool way. Like, for example, I really enjoy being able to side deck cards like Bestials or whatever, which they're not auto win in most matchups, but they're like they feel like really good cards to play with in certain matchups. And it feels important to have the ability to do that. So I do like the side deck for a lot of things. I just wish these blowout cards would be more like tackled on a potential ban list, which is, I guess, something that they have been doing more recently, right? I think the most important thing to note is that we are still in this process of banning floodgates, which is something that for some reason they've only started doing recently. But I am relatively hopeful for more floodgate hits in the future, right? Because they hit Summon Limit and Anti-Spell. Now Skill Drain and Deck Lockdown are taking their place. And so I think we're in this process where they're trying to find the balance of how far do we have to go to ban the floodgates until they're not a big problem anymore.
Something we didn't really talk about, so we can do a little surprise extra section here, but I thought it was really interesting, this idea of playing side deck cards that are, it's hard to describe it, I don't know if I'd call it an engine piece, but for example, I would used to, when I was playing a lot of BA like 2 years ago, I think, I would have like various Beatrice targets. So like bringing in like one card specifically as like a Shaddoll Aerial, I think was really good because you could use it on their third runic, send Shaddoll Aerial, their turn player, chainlink 1 Fountain, chainlink 2 Aerial, banish the 3 runics. And that's like a kind of cool thing that you can kind of do. But I don't know if there's really a lot of examples of this, because I feel like, annoyingly, I don't want to bring up the topic again, but it feels like a lot of this just goes back to floodgates, right? Because I think like Branded Fusions and Banshee for Zombie World was quite popular, for example, against like Flunder. But I can't really think of like side deck cards specifically that are in this kind of middle realm of not broken floodgates, but are things that your engine can use. Maybe in a world with like, if Macedo had best of 3, you could go like Diabell, set like the trap potentially, right? Like you could side deck. I don't know if anyone does that in TCG, probably not. No. But things like that are interesting side deck choices.
And I do like that quite a bit most of the time when you have the opportunity to do like that, because I'm a fan of like efficient side decking because when you put a card into your side deck that you have to draw for it to have an impact, the chances for it to matter are a lot lower than, for example, when you're siding a card that you can access via your engine. So it's most likely going to matter in, let's say, most of your games, right? Because you have access to it. I'm a big fan whenever you have the ability to do that. I think a very common example of it these days is like something like Thrust Targets or whatever. I think Branded is side decking Shaddoll Dragon right now to send with Branded Fusion and pop the Skill Drain. that Snake Eyes is playing, which is that's a very cool use of the card. But like you said, very often what people do with that is like, well, I'm gonna thrust to set a Featherstorm in my Fluandereeze deck or whatever, right? And then suddenly it turns from this cool concept of making a card accessible even if you only play one copy of it into like, well, yes, but the card that you side deck is a Floodgate, right? And that's annoying. But I don't think that's the issue of the side deck or the issue of cards being accessible. That's just the issue of Floodgates in general. It's just that concept is just something that no matter what angle, no matter what discussion we're having, I feel like those always come back to ruin your day. You know, whether it's with side decking or with searching or with hyper consistent decks or whatever. It's like Floodgates always come back to ruin the day.
We kind of talked about it a little bit, but it was more conceptually about time. Side decking for time, I think, is obviously something that's become very popular in the last couple of years, and necessarily so. Is there really much to say about that, right? You know, side deck cards that are good for time, don't side deck cards that are good for time.
I mean, it's unfortunately something, I mean, it's just part of the rules. So obviously people are gonna, you know, prepare for it, because realistically 45 minutes for, depending on how the games go, it's just not realistic to finish 3 games in 45 minutes. So it's naturally something that people want to prepare for. I think it does depend on what your deck does. Like there are certain decks that are a lot faster than others, where it's like, I think more reasonable to not do it. Then there's other decks that, like it depends on how many hoops you have to jump through to get there, basically. Like if you're playing a deck that just doesn't have a good way to do it, then you shouldn't go out of your way to play a card like, I don't know, Firecracker or something that just like you need to draw and it randomly inflicts 1,000 and like otherwise it doesn't do anything, right? Like it's much more better. It's much better when you have an efficient way of doing it. Like, I don't know, like the Red Resonator you mentioned was like always accessible. So it was one card you sided, but it was there basically all the time when you needed it. So that's very efficient. Those sort of things. You don't want to like play a deck that doesn't have a way to search anything, and then you play like 6 copies of a time card, or six time cards in total just to have something that you can realistically draw. That's not a good idea. But yeah, realistically, it's just something that if you're playing a deck that isn't like exceptionally fast, and if it has a way to do it, then you might want to do it, especially if your deck is weak to time. Like I have this one experience where I didn't play anything for timeout situations in my Pearly deck for YCS Dortmund, which is a deck that when it goes first, it pays 500 for my friend Pearly and then just has a miserable time. Like I just had a miserable time at YCS Dortmund because like I wasn't prepared for time at all, and just like it was just awkward a lot of the time. So yeah.
Well, in terms of specifics, I think that there's 2 types of time cards. There are the time cards that you can just activate at any time to beat your opponent. I think probably the most popular we've seen is something like Spooky Dogwood. The other popular type of time card is engine time cards. So Tearlament can go like Sprints and Scattershot. You can also play Dogwood and then add it back with Toad after you've negated. You can do cool things like that as well. But I think, like, as a general rule of thumb, if your deck has an engine way of dealing damage, you should probably side deck 1 card for this. Agave Dragon, Cowboy. There's a lot of options depending on what deck you're playing to be able to like utilize this, and I think it's an important piece to do. But the question is like, is there counter side options to this, and should you be countering this? If you know that your opponent gets to go first, basically uninhibited, do you side deck Dogwoods for that situation? Do you side deck Firecracker for that situation? Because I don't think I've ever seen Firecracker played in TCG.
I think it was played at the very beginning of when they introduced those time rules, right? And it's just like if people took it more as a meme or something. I think it comes down to I don't know exactly how I pinpoint when a deck needs a card like that and when it doesn't. I think it's just generally, I think decks that struggle to deal damage at all want to have something for these situations. Like, for example, Runic is a deck that if your opponent goes first, even if there's 10 minutes left on the clock or something, like you're not able to deal damage because you have to activate a Runic card, and that means like those 10 minutes your opponent plays their full first turn, then you play the full second turn, then your opponent plays the third turn, and then you might have a battle phase on the fourth turn if you don't have a runic card on their third turn. So basically, you're not doing damage, right? So like that deck needs to be prepared for it, because even if there's 10 or 15 minutes left, your opponent knows what they're doing, they're not going to take damage otherwise. So it's simply a matter of there are certain decks that need to do it, and then there are decks that feasibly might not have to because they're not that slow and don't pay life points for anything and just like get away without it. Like I think Snake Eyes at the moment is like not a deck that necessarily needs to do it, because the deck is like, depending on how the games go with like the hand traps, is like relatively fast and you're not paying life points for anything and you always have your battle phase. You can put up some damage relatively quickly. So it's like a deck that I don't think that deck really needs it, and I don't think the deck does play any at the moment, at least not from what I'm seeing, and I would be inclined to agree that that deck doesn't need it. So yeah.
All right. Have we covered everything, do you think? Is there anything else you want to bring up before we wrap up? How long has it been? I have not tracked at all. It's
been like 1.5 easily.
Okay.
I think.
All right.
So I think we've covered a lot. It's something that it's a very hard topic to grasp even in like 90 minutes to talk about side decking in all of its aspects. It's something that I've been wanting to make a video about in like a structured way in a long time, but I just haven't found the time to sit down and like properly script it. But I hope that we were able to give you some insights into some of the concepts, even though I'm sure we missed some things here and there. Absolutely possible. But I do think we gave you guys a good overview about some of the things to keep in mind and some of the things to pay attention to when you're building a side deck and when you are siding in a match.
We'll take one random quick question from the chat here before we sign off for today. And I think I saw a couple of people ask about this. What do you think about the concept of a side deck ban list? Conceptually, as a thought experiment, I think it's kind of a cool idea. Practically, I don't think that we'll ever see anything like that. It just adds too many like cogs in an already complicated game. I kind of low-key like the Duel Link system. I think it would be a kind of cool way to like experiment with a format of Yu-Gi-Oh! For those of you who don't know how it works, Duel Links has a lot of cards that are limited to 3, which sounds really bizarre. But what that means is, let's say Ash Blossom, Imperm, and Veiler are at 3. That means you can only play a total copy of 3 of those among all of those cards. So you could play 1 Ash, 1 Veiler, 1 Imperm, or 2 Ash, 1 Imperm, etc., etc. So that's a different style of ban list you could have, and that's something I'm a fan of. But yeah, side deck ban list, thoughts? No? Nothing like that?
It's like you said, it's a thought experiment that's only gonna remain a thought experiment forever, because it's so off the wall, like wild idea that it's never gonna happen. The same is probably true about the best of 2 we yapped about for like 10 minutes earlier though. So I think low-key, if they were to put the right cards on that list, I'd be okay with it, because there are certain cards that I genuinely think if you put like, if let's say you put Anti-Spell into your main deck, I'm not fine with the card itself, but I'm almost fine with it in that context, because it's going to be good for you 50% of the time and completely awful the other 50. Because the way that like that would balance the floodgates in some way if people had to main deck them, and they would always suck if they were going second. Whereas right now, if you're playing those cards in the side deck, you're only getting them when they're at their best, when they're at their most powerful. You never have to suffer the drawback of drawing them when you're going second, right? And the side deck ban list, provided they would put the right cards on it, right? That's another big deal, right? That's like, you know, you're asking a lot. You're asking a new concept, and you're also asking them to put the right cards on it. But it could be an interesting concept, even though it's probably not going to happen.
I think like my biggest criticism of this is like, what would you put on a ban list that you wouldn't just put on the regular ban list? Like you kind of gave the example of Anti-Spell, but like, why not just both? I feel like, right? Like I don't think there was ever a situation where a card should be banned in the side deck, but it shouldn't be legal in the real game, right? Like I feel like that it's always going to be a crossover for you should just ban it. Period.
I think that's fair enough. I think if you're at the point where you're recognizing, okay, this card, if people side deck it in, it makes games degenerate and go real fast, and non-games and all that. I think if you're at that point, just ban Anti-Spell. or ban skill drain or whatever, right? Like that. I guess that's the next step, right? So, well,
Is anti-spell banned or is it limited? What's it?
it's
Summon limit
limited
is
because
the
it's okay if
yeah,
you only
okay.
draw it like what is it,
7%
of the time?
Okay, so yeah, I always get it mixed up because it happened at the same time as summon limit, which is just bizarre because we banned one but limited the other. I don't understand
Yes.
it. But like, anyway, that's a thought experiment for another day. We'll be taking some suggestions on the next topic. It could be a bit of a national roundup next week. We'll see because we have quite a decent number of national tournaments under
Yeah, we're
our
like in the
belt now.
like halfway done. Biggest national already happened with French nationals, I think. I'm pretty sure it's going to be bigger, or it was bigger than German nationals is going to be. I'm not entirely sure how many tickets we had for German nationals, but like we're like halfway through and some big ones already happened.
It could be a little bit of a spanner with YCS Indianapolis, but maybe we'll do like a separate YCS Indy, maybe with the winner potentially when we jump that hurdle. But yeah, any suggestions and stuff for this for the podcast, then feel free to let us know in the comment section down below. I really do want to create a Discord at some point. I'm sorry, we've talked so much about like Patreon exclusive things and stuff like that. And just ways to get people more involved with the podcast because we've created like a really passionate listening base, which is really awesome to see. So a Discord of sorts could be kind of cool, just bringing both of our communities together, plus people who really like the podcast. So yeah, next topic for next week, most likely to be a roundup of the TCG results over the last couple of weeks with the various national tournaments and big regionals, etc. Thanks everyone for tuning in as always, and we'll see you next week.
Bye bye. Thanks for listening.